Hello and welcome to part 4 of our series, The Rise. Today we are looking at the plagues, the major plagues that hit Christianity, that hit the Roman Empire, I should say, and what it was like for Christianity in a time when Christians often were still persecuted before it was legal, before it was the dominant religion in the empire. Let's look at what happened. Now, before we go further, we need to make sure we're on the same page and that we know what we're talking about. When we talk about pagans, for example, we're going to use the word pagan to refer to non-Christians here in this presentation. That term, pagan, has been used to mean a lot of different things. It has different implications for different people, but for today, it simply means they were non-Christian, many of which observed the Roman religion of the day. And then, of course, Christian refers to practicing believers of Jesus Christ, people who were involved, converted, practicing their faith of Christianity. So a couple of significant plagues hit the Roman Empire within the span of 100 years, and it was a pretty big deal. The first one came in 165 AD, and this plague was so bad, it took the life of the emperor itself. But it took an estimated 1/4 to 1/3 of the population. Not just 1/4 to 1/3 of the people that came down with it. No, it was 1/4 to 1/3 of the population of people died from this plague. They think it might have been something like smallpox. If smallpox gets introduced to a population that previously hasn't been exposed to it, then it can be very deadly. But so many people died that entire cities and villages were abandoned. It interrupted a war that was going on. In fact, it seems like the war was the cause. Some of the army was in the east, and it seems like that's what brought the plague over to the Roman Empire and much of what we know as Western Asia and Europe and Northern Africa. But then after a while, in 251, there was another plague. We don't really know for sure what it was. You can speculate a lot of different directions. It could have been measles. It could have been influenza. It could have been a filovirus like Ebola. Whatever it was, it had similar results. It wiped out about 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire Roman Empire. Again, make sure you understand, this isn't just the mortality rate of the people that get it, it's the mortality rate of the whole empire. 1/4 to 1/3 of the empire. That's crazy. So what we want to look at today is this real contrast between the pagan response, the pagan understanding, the pagan reaction to the plagues, and the Christian response, the Christian understanding of the plagues. And it's clear from the records of the time, but also from the results, that the pagans and the Christians had a completely different approach to the plagues and what they were seeing unfold before them. Because of their different understandings of the universe, they had completely different approaches, and they experienced different results. Now let's take a look at the pagan dilemma. The priests of the day struggled to explain, what are these gods up to? Did the gods send the plagues? If so, did they even care? And so what happened was many of the priests, unable to explain, unable to help, unable to offer the right kinds of sacrifices to make any kind of difference, they fled to the country to get away from these urban hotspots. A lot of the other civil authorities that also could afford to also fled to the country, leaving those that were back home with a lot less leadership and a lot less direction, a lot less help. Even the philosophers of the time weren't providing any kind of meaning to the whole situation, perhaps only observations that were subject to the random conditions of nature, and some just happened to be less fortunate than others. And Galen was a famous classical physician that lived in this time. And he wasn't much help either. He too fled to his country estate. Now, these fleeing physicians and priests, they don't look too great to us looking back. But at the time, it was seen as a reasonable thing for someone with the means to do. to do something like that. Medical technology wasn't advanced to the point of understanding germ theory or a lot concerning the nature of bacteria and viruses. So this was the reasonable thing for them to do is get away. At worst, with no religious prompt to care for one another, everyone was looking out for themselves. At best, the thought is that, well, this is clearly spreading from one person to another. I can't help them. They're probably going to perish, so there's no point in both of us dying, right? And in this religion, in the pagan religion, you've got to understand that the gods didn't really seem to care how you treated your neighbor. They didn't seem to care if you looked after the poor and lowly. They didn't seem to care how you acted towards each other. It was all about, are you offering the right sacrifices and things like that. There wasn't any kind of impulse or directive to care for one another and love one another in the religion of the day. Now, the Christians in those days, on the other hand, had a completely fresh and different look at this. For one thing, they understood that we lived in a world that was broken, a world where natural disaster and evil would abound. But while it is a broken world with a lot of bad things happening, this world is just temporary. This was just a prelude and practice for the new heaven and the new earth that they would experience after this life. An everlasting life without pain, disease, disorder, death. In fact, if they were not convinced of this glorious everlasting life, they likely would not be practicing Christianity at the time already anyway, before the plague, because they very well could be put to death for doing so. These Christians were so much believers that they literally did not fear death. They did not let death keep them from doing their faith, from practicing their faith, even if it meant death. So if we are to believe the countless writings that we see of the time, they welcomed martyrdom as if it were a blessed and awesome way to go out. So, being so fearless in the face of persecution in the first place, it shouldn't surprise us that when another source of great peril came in the form of the plagues, they stood firm in their faith. A church leader named Dionysius wrote, "Other people would not think this is a time for festival. Far from being a time of distress, it is a time of unimaginable joy." So while the death rate terrified the pagans, Christians greeted the epidemic as merely schooling and testing, like practice. Now, not only did they stand firm in their faith facing death, not only did they experience a certain level of peace in the face of death that the pagans didn't experience, but they also didn't shy away from doing the right thing, the things that their faith compelled them to do. And what did they see necessary to do? They went to the people who were suffering. They cared for the dying. They comforted the sick. They provided basic nursing care to them. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that this was the case, but here are some quotes from just one source that I think summarizes the scene pretty well. So I mentioned some things a few seconds ago that Dionysius said. Here are some more of his comments about the plague of 251 that he lived through. He says, "Most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves, and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely happy. For they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors, and cheerfully accepting their pains. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. The best of our brothers lost their lives in this manner, a number of presbyters, deacons, and laymen, winning high commendation, so that death in this form, the result of great piety and strong faith, seems in every way the equal of martyrdom." Dionysius also remarked on how devastating the death toll was on the general population. He said, "There's not a house in which there is not one dead." However, he also mentioned in the same letter that the pagans experienced worse results from the plague, writing, "Its full impact fell on the heathen." Now here's something else that Dionysius said, quote, "The heathen behaved in the very opposite way. At the first onset of the disease, they pushed the sufferers away and fled from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead, and treated unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread and contagion of the fatal disease. But do what they may, they found it difficult to escape." Now, what Stark does is he makes a case that because of the difference in how the Christians responded to the plague, the rates of conversion to Christianity very likely increased, at least for a time, and the proportion of Christians to pagans in the empire in general was most certainly affected. In other words, this Christian faith that was already growing in the empire grew even more during the plagues because of their response to the plague. So what difference did it make if pagans were running from the plague and Christians were running to it? Well, here's something to consider from what we know. I have a couple of quotes from two of these books. One is the book Plagues and Peoples. It's written by William H. McNeill. And here's what William McNeill says. "When all normal services break down, quite elementary nursing will greatly reduce mortality. Simple provision of food and water, for instance, will allow persons who are temporarily too weak to cope for themselves to recover instead of perishing miserably." And Stark says this, "Modern medical experts believe that conscientious nursing without any medications could cut the mortality rate by 2/3 or even more." So with this in mind, Stark makes the suggestion that Christians who were caring for one another and caring also for the pagans would have seen not the same level of death among them as the pagans who were not caring for each other to the same level would. In fact, he illustrates this pretty well in his book, that because of this, Christianity closed the gap in the ratio of pagans to Christians in the Roman Empire. They took up more of the population after the plagues than before because they were caring for one another. To get the complete picture, let's look at some calculations that Stark has provided. Okay? So we're calling this differential mortality and growth. That's what we're looking at here. So plague number 1 in 165 AD. At the time, pagans outnumbered Christians a ratio of 249 to 1. So for every one Christian, there were 249 non-Christians in the empire. If you had a town, say, of about 10,000 people, for example, then of those 10,000, 9,960 would be pagan and 40 would be Christian, according to this ratio. Then, if the plague hits, and the plague takes about 30% of the pagan population, but only 10% of the Christian population, that results in a new ratio of 6,972 pagans and 36 Christians. Now, he wants to make sure that you remember that Christianity would have maintained their current growth rate before the plagues and after the plagues. They were maintaining a growth rate of about 40% per decade. So this plague lasted between 10 and 15 years. During that time, if Christianity took 40% growth, taking that from the pagan side, then that number of population in this town, this hypothetical town of 10,000, would then be 6,956 pagans to 52 Christians, which is a new ratio of 134 to 1, 134 pagans for every one Christian. So you see, that's quite a different ratio than what we started out with 249 to 1 going to 134 to 1 in the empire after the plague. That's quite the jump if what Stark says is true. And if you apply this to the whole Roman Empire, it would have made a good bit of a difference. Now, plague number 2 in 251 AD, you'll remember, had the pretty much the same death toll, the same effect on the population. So you take the same town, advance it nearly 100 years with their population. Let's say that they have 6,210 pagans and 791 Christians. You got to remember, they did not, in the Roman Empire, and a lot of historians have written about this, they didn't make up their population decline very well. Okay, so the population had actually declined overall in a lot of ways. So let's say this town has 6,210 pagans in the year 251 AD and 791 Christians. And then another plague hits, and you see the same death toll take place on both groups. And you end up with 4,347 pagans to 712 Christians. But then you apply the growth rate, and you have 4,062 pagans for every 997 Christians. Better put as for every one Christian, there were 4 pagans. So you have a new ratio of 4 pagans, 4 non-Christians for every one Christian. What an incredible leap that has taken from even 134 to 1, but also 249 to 1. That would have been something that would have been clearly felt across the empire if Christians now made up 1 out of every 5 people that you came across, as opposed to 1 out of every 250 people that you came across. So one thing that Stark also says is that had there been no plagues by 260 AD, then the ratio would have been closer to 8 to 1, which still is significantly different, but it would have been a lot slower of a rise, and would not have seen the drastic effects, because you got to remember that just about 60 years after, less than 60 years after this plague was through, Christianity was the now dominant religion on the landscape, or at least enough of the Roman Empire was practicing Christianity that Constantine did that whole conversion thing in the Edict of Milan and the legalization, and then it became this Christian empire shortly thereafter. So one other thing to look at here is the survival of attachments, the bonds that people have to one another. And Stark points out that after the plague, certain friendships and attachments would not survive. You'd lose some of your friends because of the death rate. And the survival of attachments for the Christians, for Christians to Christian attachments, was 81%. Okay? So in other words, if a Christian had, 5 friends, they might lose on average one of their friends to the plague. Christian to pagan, the survival of attachment rate was 63%. And then pagan to pagan would have been 49%. And he even suggests that those bottom two percentages would have been even lower because of pagan flight. So they were not only losing attachments due to death from the plague, but they were also losing attachments due to pagans fleeing to the hills, to the countryside. So real quick, one illustration that shows what this might look like on a more real level. Say you've got a pagan who has 5 friends, 1 is Christian and 4 of them are pagans, okay? And then the plague hits, and now he just has 1 Christian friend, and he just has 1 pagan friend after the plague because of flight or death or other factors. Now the potential for this pagan to become a Christian is now increased because his influences have, the proportion of his influences that are Christian has drastically changed. Especially when you consider who the pagan friend that he has as friends, and who the Christian friend that he has as friends. Hopefully I'm not confusing you here. In other words, the pagan, he might have a pagan and a Christian friend left after the plague, and the Christian might have more Christian friends after the plague. So when you look at this, our original pagan person here, and the possible new attachments that he is going to create, there's a higher possibility of him creating attachments with Christians than pagans. And this would have an influence as well on the potential for the growth of Christianity, at least looking at it from human terms, scientific, sociological terms. So there was a lesson in contrast there that when Christians follow their convictions, the teachings of Jesus, what God wants them to do in the face of death, doing the right thing, caring for their brothers and sisters, caring for their neighbors, and even loving their enemies, you saw that it provided much greater peace and joy and even survival for their people. But there's another lesson in contrast here that I won't go too much into detail about. We've talked about it in class before, but the Black Death, about 1,000 years later, hit a mostly Christian population, at least Christian in name, right? The official religion being Christian. And the Christian leaders at that time, rather than confronting the disease and promoting care for one another, ran and hid. A large number of them ran and hid, including the Pope. They even, some of them, cast suspicion on the Jews. See, the Jews, this was a time, again, still before germ theory and all of that, the Jews were washing their hands because of what God had commanded in the Old Testament. And because of when and how the Jews were washing their hands, that was probably why less of them died in the plague of the 1300s. But instead of the Christians taking that and learning from it, or even appreciating it, I don't know, instead, some of them took it out on them and even attacked them. So it was really sad because in the 1300s, you didn't see the same level of care by the majority of the Christian population. You saw more of them looking out for themselves. And when you see the leaders particularly doing that, it gives you some pause. It's kind of disturbing. So my question is, today, what is our posture towards the threat of death? By no means do I suggest near suicidal recklessness, right? I'm not suggesting that we live in the time when we need to unnecessarily risk our lives, right? However, I do wonder if our fears ever, like our fear of death, our fear of discomfort, or our fear of social consequences, I wonder if our fear ever keeps us from living the kind of life of love that Christ commands us to live. How many things do we do to shelter ourselves from awkward or uncomfortable situations that God is calling us to do? See, Christ himself saw what it would take to bring salvation to the world. It took him being willing to lay down his life. So, do we today run towards those who need to know God and his love, or do we run the opposite direction, hiding where it is, quote unquote, safe? Regardless, today we must consider the impact of those early Christians living in such a way that has had a domino effect on history and influenced so much of what we have seen in the course of Western civilization. And we've only scratched the surface. Well, there's so much that could be said, but perhaps we have said enough today. Next, we are going to look at why did Christianity especially appeal to women growing up in the context of the Roman Empire in the first 3 centuries of Christianity. This is also fascinating stuff. I might not fit it into one lesson. I probably should have split this lesson into 2, but oh well. Hope you'll join us and hope you are enjoying and learning something from these lessons. Thank you so much for taking the time. Bye.